The Vietnam Experience. It was 1972 and Nixon was president. The Godfather movie had just been released, Libertarians had their first convention, and I was old enough for military service. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 18 and just graduated high school in May. My mother and father were there to see me released into the world of hard work and dedication. However, that was not the case, as I decided to fight for a cause and signed up for the Army in June of 1972. After 3 months of boot camp, learning how to be a soldier, how to fight hand-to-hand, and weapons training, I was shipped out from boot camp to my home on pre-deployment leave before being deployed. After a short stay at home, I was shipped on a plane to a mysterious land known as Vietnam. I had only heard about the mysteries of Vietnam in the local news. It was mostly stories about troops missing in action, prisoners of war in North Vietnam camps, and men who were found deep in the jungle, slaughtered by the red evil known as the Viet Cong. However, I still continued with no regrets, thinking I was going to fight for the freedom of the Vietnamese people, to liberate them for the better good of the world. Going from San Diego to Vietnam was a harsh plane ride, especially with all the storms while crossing the Pacific Ocean. However, to pass the time, I talked to some of the other fellows from the plane. First was a guy from Austin, Texas, who gave his name as Paul. Paul was an 18-year-old high school flunk who decided that his only path after school was to go into the Army. Paul's sense of employment made him a happy man with no real problems. There was also a kid from Stockton, California named Carson. Carson was of half Vietnamese, half Irish descent and decided to fight for South Vietnam's cause. He spoke fluent Vietnamese and English from his mother's side, and he would always be cracking swear words in Vietnamese. He was obviously the quirkiest kid from the group, being this 20-something fellow who always cracked jokes to make everyone feel better. I soon befriended the two fellows and we were the best of buddies by the end of the flight. We arrived at the military base in Saigon, and were allowed a few days to roam the city before the deployment into the jungle. While time was on my side, I ventured into the back streets of Saigon. I stumbled on an old bookstore, which I took a peek inside to reveal thousands of books, mostly written in Vietnamese. The woman behind the counter looked at me and then went to the back. I decided to look at the folklore section, which was full of stories told by locals and traditions past. I then saw a book in English that looked a little worn and decided to take a look inside. I opened it up to page 1, and found the image of a frightening dragon with large red eyes. I wasn't scared but decided to read the story anyway. It mostly talked about a dragon that roamed the jungle, looking for prey unless someone offered a sacrifice. After reading it, I thought it was the cheesiest read I ever laid my eyes upon. However, as I turned around, the shopkeeper looked at me and said politely in English, "You better walk with your eyes open in those trees," and then walked away. I was kind of confused but just walked out and proceeded back to the base. After a few days in Saigon, we were given our mission, and being privates we would be the first ones sent in to look for the Viet Cong, and would investigate the local jungles, with our main objective being to scout out prisoners taken by the enemy. Me and about 200 men were shipped off in jeeps to the battle zone, specifically the border between North and South Vietnam. Arriving at our destination, it was a very quiet place. Nothing but the sound of small birds in the distance. It was a large, ancient jungle that didn't seem to be of any real significance. The man in charge told us to get ready and set up camp, which we promptly did. His name was Sergeant Rogers, and he was a ripped guy who had to be over 250 pounds. He walked like he had to be doing something at all times, but was not one of those yell-in-your-face type fellows. Instead, he treated the men in his brigade as if he was another soldier just giving orders. After some time setting up camp, Carson, Paul, and myself were sent off to investigate the thick jungle. Grabbing our guns, we quietly walked out into the trees, scouting for anything that we could see. The place was quiet and we heard nothing but the chirping of bugs and the occasional bird. If it wasn't for the war that was going on there, it would have been a beautiful vacationing spot. After a few hours of scouting and seeing nothing, we headed back to base camp, but not before Carson saw something crude in the distance. It looked like something man-made, like a big rock building of some sort. We then approached the huge building only to find that it was a large abandoned temple of sorts. We approached the temple thinking something could be in there, and only then heard footsteps and someone yelling something in Vietnamese a few hundred feet away. It was the Viet Cong. We came back to camp and told our superior the story of the temple in the middle of the jungle. He just laughed and said those were old Buddhist temples that had long been forgotten. Even though our superior didn't care, we were still deeply interested in those temples. Another day we were picked again to scout out the jungle. This time we decided to venture deeper into the thickness of vines and trees. After a few miles of venturing into the dense trees, we saw a camp of the Reds. It was an encampment of a few hundred men which were just a mere 100 yards from us. We just saw soldiers, and after taking a good look at the entire encampment, we could see no prisoners. We scouted the thickness of the jungle for a few hours, writing the daily log of what we saw so we could make a report to Rogers, which was mostly troop numbers, distance away, and direction. We stayed at the side of the camp for a few hours, when a Red soldier approached in the distance without seeing us. He pulled something out from his pocket and we were ready for the worst, but it was just a Zippo lighter and he was just out for a smoke. Carson, who was hyped up to capture this guy, suggested a plan. We would go up to the soldier, capture and gag him, and try to get any information about our side's missing soldiers. We decided to put this plan into full effect and try to get anything out of this soldier we could. We surrounded the guy at all sides, slowly approaching him in a quiet fashion. He was about another 20 feet away from all of us, so close I could smell his cigarette burning. Slowly walking as close as I could, I finally saw the orange part of his burning cigarette as he took it out of his mouth. I then grabbed my pistol and rag and crept up behind him, grabbing him and gagging him. He let out some sort of muffled scream of help, but I was not going to let him go. Carson and Paul then held him down as he tried screaming for us to release him. Carson then held a knife to the soldier's neck, and told him in Vietnamese that if he screamed once he would cut his neck wide open. The man went quiet, sweating bullets out of fear for his life. Carson then started talking to the man in his native tongue, trying to find out any information that he knew. The man and Carson talked for about 5 minutes until Carson, in disgust, let the man down and then beat him with the butt of his gun, leaving the man unconscious so we could get away. We then went on the ferocious hike back to camp, tired and covered in mud from the jungle. I then popped the question about what the man said. Carson, who was mad, blankly said, "The man said there is no prisoner of war camp near this area, and that men from their encampment have disappeared as well." I was dumbfounded, knowing that we had not captured any enemies since we got here. I then walked back and was speechless as we walked to the encampment. The three of us walked to Roger's tent and explained to him that there were no prisoners at the camp, and all about the soldier. Rogers was almost as confused as us, but then gave us orders to head back to our quarters, as if something was bothering him. His face as we just stared at him was red mad as if someone had murdered his wife. He then proceeded to yell at us to get back to the quarters, and we scurried back to our beds. Paul wanted to know why Rogers was so mad with us, especially considering we'd done our job and scouted the enemy. I couldn't answer him and neither could Carson, but he did admit something he hadn't told us before. He said that he thought Rogers was holding something back, and that the captured soldier had said something about a serpent-like creature when his own comrades disappeared. Both Paul and me were pretty mad that he hadn't told us or Rogers before, but Carson explained that he didn't believe the soldier, so had no reason to tell us, and Rogers wouldn't either. After some back and forth we agreed with him, and also his suggestion that we keep it to ourselves. After all, none of us wanted to get a Section 8 discharge for being crazy. The three of us then shook on it and proceeded nervously to our bunks. A few days passed by and we were preparing to advance toward the North Vietnamese camp that we'd spotted earlier. Rogers explained that this would be a routine mission and that we would be going deep into the jungle to attack the enemy. Rogers had a nervous look on his face but was ready to send the troops into battle. We then grabbed our guns and supplies and walked through the jungle. Our first job was to clear a path by removing trees and other debris, mostly with construction equipment and flamethrowers. Carson and I were put on flamethrower duty and Paul was put on clearing the debris. We spent another few hours clearing trees and rocks before setting up camp deep within the forest. We began setting up sandbags and digging holes, preparing for the attack. Then we saw the Vietnamese. It was a counterattack force just a few hundred yards away. We grabbed our guns and a firefight soon engulfed the two forces as we battled deep into the night. Bullets were grazing past me and Paul as we reloaded our guns. Paul had killed about 10 to 12 of the enemy before Rogers yelled out for the big guns. I was lucky if I had even shot one or two guys, as it was my first battle against real people. Our guns began firing on the enemy, and as the Vietnamese were underpowered in weapons, they were running at us in a futile attempt to engage hand-to-hand. We began taking them down with all the firepower we had. We began to cheer, but it wasn't for long as more Reds kept appearing through the trees with evil in their eyes, their dead bodies just piling on top of each other. Then everything started to fall apart. Snipers in the trees began to pick us off one by one, killing many good men around me. Paul was grazed in the leg and Rogers yelled out for a retreat. All of us began to fall back as more and more bodies from our side began to fall. By then Rogers was already off the battlefield and most of the survivors were running toward the south. I then heard Paul crying out that he was shot in the leg. I grabbed him and put him over my shoulder with Carson giving us cover fire. It was then that we were almost surrounded and began to run eastward. I shouted that the temple could be our place of refuge until the enemy withdrew. We dragged Paul to the temple, which was a long 2-mile walk. We then saw the temple in the moonlight, with its ancient vegetation growing all over the old stone walls. I began hearing shouting behind us as we ran into the temple. It was dark and quiet for most of the night. I walked outside to find a few of the Reds looking at me, seeing that I was in the temple, but they looked terrified with blank expressions. They ran off shouting something in Vietnamese. They were yelling out, "Con Rome! Con Rome!" Confused and pissed off, I sprayed a bunch of bullets to ward them off and ran back into the fortress. I told Carson that those bastards were gone, and they were running for their lives back into the jungle, not telling him what they said. Carson was busy tending to Paul's wounds, which were getting better, but he could still not walk on his own. I proceeded to walk through the old temple to get a feel for what we were in. Mostly what I found were statues of some fellow I didn't know and paintings of dragons everywhere. The drawings depicted people running out of a temple and into a jungle, being followed by a dragon-looking creature. The creature was yellow with red eyes and a red stripe. It had sharp teeth and a sinister face, looking like it was going to devour someone. I then walked deeper into the temple with my lighter, looking at these paintings of this dragon, which showed it doing anything from sitting on top of some temple, to devouring people. I was deeply into these drawings when I heard a large bump at the end of the corridor. It was Carson. He looked at the drawings and was shocked by the content. He said they were from a local dragon legend. According to Carson, the Vietnamese, like many East Asian cultures, were very intertwined with the dragon in their stories. He didn't know this particular story, but said that dragons in Vietnamese culture were often said to be bringers of rain, particularly in agriculture. He also said they believed the dragon to be a father figure to the men, and it was even included in their creation stories. They signified that they brought much good to the world, but this dragon is very different from the ones in Vietnamese folklore. He said that this dragon was evil and was a vicious killer, not like the loving creatures typically depicted. Just as he was about to explain more, we heard Paul scream. We ran back and he explained that something was growling at him in the darkness. We looked outside to see the silhouette of something in the distance, just staring at us with these big red eyes. It looked like some kind of large bird with the body of a worm. It was growling and had a huge snout, like a lion. It was hunched over the body of a man who was screaming for his very life, as the monster started eating from his torso. The creature ripped flesh and tissue from the man, swallowing his intestines like spaghetti. It then turned around and growled at us from outside the temple and began waving its wings. We saw its face as it tried breaking into the temple, and it looked terrible before it flew off to kill something else to eat. We ran deeper inside, into a large atrium, and stayed there for a few hours, hearing the creature's snarls and screeching. It screamed and was banging on the walls of the temple trying to get us. We just remained in the atrium. Hours passed and it went silent for a while. We heard the occasional bird. I picked up my lighter and made a makeshift fire with pieces of cloth and leaves. I then noticed the same silhouette of something in the background. I hopped back, thinking it was the beast, but it was just a statue of the same dragon covered in gold and ruby. Carson explained that whoever visited that place didn't just fear this creature, they also worshipped it. I walked towards the back of the atrium and noticed a room going to the back of the temple. It went to a long line of stairs which proceeded to a room with an opening big enough to fit the dragon. Inside the room were drawings of dragons everywhere, and a large altar big enough for a human to be sacrificed. It was covered in dirt and leaves, but it was definitely for sacrifices, as I found plenty of ceremonial daggers nearby made of gold. I then heard a hiss above me and saw the dragon coming down with its claws extended. It missed me but scratched me deep on one leg. I heard its musky breath from the other side of the cavern. It let out a roar and I smelled the stench of rotten flesh coming at me from its maw. It tried to grab me from the corner of the room. I ran to the open door, back to the atrium, but not before it grabbed my leg. With its claws digging deeply into my flesh, I let out a shriek and grabbed my revolver from its holster and shot it in the arm. It shrieked out and yelled, and I saw this as my opportunity to get out of there. I crawled back to the open door and escaped the beast by climbing back to the atrium where my colleagues were. We waited for daylight to come, which seemed like an eternity. Paul's bleeding had finally stopped, and we picked him up and proceeded to walk out of the temple to civilization. My eyes adjusted to the incoming daylight as we swiftly walked out of the temple towards the American camp. We walked for what seemed like hours, only to find a crew of mangled corpses of Vietnamese troops near a large tanker truck. They looked like they were ripped to shreds by nothing man-made. One of the men was ripped in half at the torso and missing his lower half. Another man was missing his body and only his head was left. Something had taken down an entire battalion of Vietnamese. We knew what did this but weren't going to stay around for confirmation. We began to check the bodies and looked for any necessary supplies, finding water and some painkillers. We suddenly heard a faint cry for help in the distance. We walked in awe towards the dying man. He was yelling that word in Vietnamese again. Carson talked to the man, and he told us about a serpent with wings and how it ambushed them. He talked to us for a few more minutes about the creature, which just would not die, and about how the creature severed a huge gash in his leg in an incoming attack which happened a few hours before. He was able to survive for a while, but kept blanking in and out of consciousness. He then began going into shock and kept shouting the same word until he died, con Rome. By then I was sick to my stomach and throwing up whatever content was in my body, trying to understand what the hell was going on. All I wanted to do was go home and never see this shit again. I was sick as could be and grabbed a swig of water from my canteen, which was halfway full. We walked through the entire camp, leaving the mangled bodies and corpses behind on the way back to our own camp. We began walking for what seemed like hours, stopping to give us a break in carrying Paul, which was okay for the time being. His leg, however, began showing signs of infection. We finally saw the familiar sight of an American Jeep in the distance, hoping that someone was still alive. We had finally made it back to the American camp, which seemed to be pretty deserted. Jeeps and tents were all but abandoned within the area, mostly everything charred like it had been in a fire. Then corpses began to appear just like in the Vietnamese camp. Charred remains of men were all over the place, half-eaten men with their innards torn out and scattered. It was a disaster zone. We began walking through the entire encampment, trying to find some life when we saw a handful of Americans, including Rogers. Rogers was loading up gasoline into a large Jeep with a few injured and healthy people in it getting ready to leave. We began yelling at Rogers that we were okay as he yelled back and waved to come along. We dragged Paul to the Jeep and put him on gently. Many of the men on the Jeep looked injured, including Rogers, who appeared scared out of his mind. He then said to us that everyone in the battalion was dead but us, and we were lucky to survive. He later said that no one from either side was still alive. After a pause, he started talking again. After the retreat, they'd ran towards the base camp area where we'd settled before and stopped there for prep work in the morning. Then something came in the distance and began to attack them. He told how the thing was everywhere, slaying troops one by one with its big red eyes and bloody teeth. It was flying around their jeeps and stopping anyone from leaving, charring men and torching them to death, ripping them apart piece by piece. While it was occupied, they ran into the nearby forest and hid in a small cave until the thing left. That was when Rogers began finding survivors and the Jeep. We then began talking about our own encounters with this creature and how it killed many men along the way. By the time we finished explaining all of our stories, we reached a small town outside of Saigon and went to the nearest American military post. That's where my story ends. After that horrible encounter, all 12 of us were relieved of our military duty due to combat stress, and were never given an explanation on that serpent. We were flown back to the States and then sent to a mental health division of the VA. The doctors said the dragon was just a result of the stress we had endured, but I know what we saw. After the scramble, we all went our separate ways. As for the others of the few that survived, I only know of what happened to Paul, Rogers, and Carson. After returning home, Paul had his leg amputated. He lived a nice life until he began having flashbacks of the dragon and the temple. He was admitted into a mental health clinic in 1984 where he died a year later. Rogers worked at a local grocery store where he later became the manager. However, due to constant headaches and hearing voices, he committed suicide in 1995, leaving a suicide note about how he was hearing noises from outside his window and seeing red eyes behind him. As for Carson, he still contacts me on occasion, and after returning home got his degree in Eastern Religious Studies from the University of Michigan. He is still studying about the dragon in the tomb, and has implied that he might go back to Vietnam, trying to solve the mystery of the murders. As for all the other men killed that day, I don't know. It was never explained to me what happened to the many people who were slaughtered by that dragon. In the end, I still know what I saw, and I know the other two men saw the same. The thing still stalks me in my thoughts and in my sleep. The doctors from the VA still say it's the stress of being in a war, but I know what I saw and it was not a hallucination. I know that thing is still out there waiting to kill me, waiting to skin me alive, waiting to devour me with its razor-sharp teeth. And it will still be waiting for me in my dreams.